Hello and welcome from me, David Foster, to this, our weekly look inside Syria. In recent weeks, Syrian government forces have firmly seized the momentum in the country's civil war, capturing one rebel stronghold after another. The government's recent gains in the outskirts of the capital, Damascus, and also in the north outside the biggest city, Aleppo, have reinforced President Bashar al-Assad's position. And some analysts are saying such battlefield gains will strengthen the government's position in any peace talks that may be held. Al Jazeera's Raya Rageh has more.
In the war in Syria, the momentum has shifted. Government forces have made significant advances in recent weeks in what appears to be a new strategy to surround the rebels. After days of fighting, the army pushed opposition fighters out of a number of suburbs close to the capital Damascus, effectively eliminating the rebels' ability to strike the regime in its heartland. Shortly after that, more fighting close to the Lebanese border gave President Assad's troops an advantage in Qalamun Mountains, an area that was in rebel hands for most of the war and on which they depended for smuggling weapons. The army has also advanced on rebel strongholds in the north, recapturing several towns around Aleppo and regaining access to previously besieged bases and supply routes. The government's recent strategy has been steadily reversing expansive gains made by the rebels last year and has exposed just how vulnerable they are. Several factors have contributed to this. The main one is the strong support the army has received from Shia fighters from Lebanon and Iraq, as well as the disunity among the different rebel factions, with growing fighting between the Western-backed Free Syrian Army and fighters linked to al-Qaeda. Many analysts also cite U.S. policy, which has backtracked on striking the regime after a deal was reached with Russia on Syria's chemical weapons. Gone are the days of debating the possibility of a no-fly zone and aerial support for the rebels. The international community is now focused on how to destroy Assad's stockpile of chemical weapons. It's a complicated process, and no country has so far volunteered to host the neutralization process of these chemicals. In the meantime, that's all good news for President Assad, whose forces continue to regain territory, meaning that if and when peace negotiations take place in Geneva, he would be in a position of strength, not weakness. Raya Rageh for Inside Syria.
And last week, a prominent rebel group inside Syria lost its leader. Khaled Saleh controlled the Tawhid Brigade, one of the Free Syrian Army's strongest units. Under his command, the group pushed into Aleppo city last year, seizing large sections of Aleppo. He was injured in shelling from government forces and died from shrapnel wounds. On Friday, a number of major rebel groups in Syria decided to merge. The new front will represent rebel forces, they say, across Syria, calling themselves the Islamic Front.
This independent political, military and social formation aims to topple the Assad regime completely and build an Islamic state where the sovereignty of God Almighty alone will be our reference and ruler.
So to try and see the bigger picture, to analyse the current situation militarily in the war-torn country, we're joined by our three guests. In Istanbul, Khaled Saleh, who's head of the media office of the opposition Syrian National Coalition in Beirut. Elias Hanna, a defence analyst, a retired Lebanese general. And here in our studio, Michael Stevens from the Royal United Services Institute, better known as RUSI. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me. Michael Stevens, if I could ask you first of all, we heard there about specific gains made by the Syrian regime in Raya Rageh's report. Has the momentum shifted the government's way? So much so that it cannot be seized back the other way?
No, I don't think that the momentum has irreversibly shifted. I think if you look at the longer period over the last 2 years, this conflict has gone back and forward depending on supplies, manpower, whether, for example, external actors like Hezbollah were able to insert themselves in the conflict. So in the Qalamun area, where the regime has recently been making gains, Hezbollah has been clearly assisting on that front. And so they have extra manpower, well-trained soldiers able to insert themselves in the conflict. If you look at other areas of Syria like Raqqa, where the sort of jihadist brigades are in control, you do not see any progression made by the Syrian regime at all. So there are areas of the country clearly where the fighting has intensified in the last couple of weeks.
Are those areas where the jihadists have made gains of interest to the Syrian government regime, or can they effectively say, OK, we're not going to win there, but we will win in places that are so important to us, like Aleppo?
Certainly not at the moment. The regime is not trying to overstretch its resources. I think what we saw in the last couple of months was the regime trying to consolidate areas that it thought it needed to control to remain in the game, if you like, to, if you look forward to a political conversation, to at least have a strong foothold where they could push the Free Syrian Army forces onto the back foot. So I think from that perspective, you're looking at the coastal area, Tartus, Latakia, moving across into Homs, Hama, and then down into Damascus. This is the key area that the regime needs to take control of. Now we're seeing them spreading into Aleppo. The thing is, right now, if the regime tried to suddenly go into Idlib, for example, where it's very difficult to dislodge hardline Islamists from that area, I think they might be overstretching themselves. So at the moment, it's a limited offensive, but they are successful.
Khaled Saleh, let me come to you. Where would you say those forces who represent the interests of the Syrian National Coalition are making gains?
I think the FSA, all FSA units, represents the interests of the Syrian people. Let me just talk specifics over here. Just overnight, what happened is that the FSA forces were able to push back in Aleppo. They were able to control the largest oil and gas field in Deir ez-Zor. They're able to push in Homs and Hama. Just 2 days ago, we all hear about this, the Assad forces trying to control Al-Qalamon area. And this is what you hear about in the media continuously. But the reality of it, we see the FSA units, and for the first time, entering and controlling Deir Atiyah, a very strategic city on the international highway that connects Damascus to Homs. So the reality on the ground is completely different. We heard that the Assad forces are going to be able to push into Aleppo. The reality of it, over the last 2 days, the FSA forces have been able to capture 18 to 19 different cities and villages in that area.
Let me ask Elias Hanna this, because General Hanna, you can possibly give us a slightly more objective view of this. It was said 12 months ago by a company called Stratfor, an intelligence company, that the situation in Aleppo for the regime was essentially dire, that it was surrounded, and then we had the Deputy Prime Minister saying all supply routes into Aleppo for the regime had been cut off. It was like the siege of Leningrad, and that was only 10 months ago. Has it gone the other way now, or is the regime still in trouble there?
I think that there is a shift of momentum now, but not to a degree that the regime can retake all of Syria. On the other hand, not the rebels can really dislodge or dethrone Bashar al-Assad. The shift and the dynamics are from the tactical level to the strategic level, as well as to the regional and international level, and the question of the chemical weapons. Now, I think that now we are seeing a period of consolidation and the clearing areas in order to go to the political level. I think that all what the rebels have done so far are tactical, but not really. This cumulative effect of these tactical will lead to a major shift or change. And moreover, the Syrian army, the regime's army, I think that becoming more experienced, leaner, and more hardened, and they are fighting, and the morale is very high. Moreover, the cleaning area, or the area between Lebanon and the backyard of Damascus, is becoming more cleaner, and the regime is fighting on what we call in the military parlance the interior line, as well. On the other hand, the rebels are fighting on the exterior line. They are so extended, no unity of command. There are differences in the political level, ideological level, as well as the military level. And here comes the main problem. And at the same time, they don't have a game changer as far as the weaponry is concerned.
So let me throw this back to Khaled Saleh at this point. The fact is you don't have the ammunition. The Free Syrian Army isn't getting the help that it wanted from its so-called friends, help that it believed it would get in the early days of the revolution, and the ammunition is going elsewhere.
That's not an issue because at this point we are getting a little bit of ammunition and support, but the reality of it's up to 90% of the ammunition that the Free Syrian Army is relying on and is using is from the warehouses and the caches of the Assad regime. Just less than about 10 days ago, the FSA managed to capture the largest caches of weapons in the countryside of Homs. Now the FSA is actually pushing into Division 17th in Raqqa. Today they're also pushing just early in the morning, around 5 a.m. Damascus time. They started to push into areas where there's large concentrations of weapons in Deir ez-Zor. So I think the reality of it, if the international community is not going to help us, there is plenty of weapons in Syria, and this is what the FSA's strategy has been relying on.
Okay, let's put Michael Stevens on the spot here when it comes to the munitions. Can the FSA do the job it wants simply by capturing, as it says, enough of Bashar al-Assad's weapons, rather than being given it by the people that it hoped it would get it from?
No, and this is precisely why Salam Idris a few months ago was asking the Americans for specific types of weaponry to help swing the conflict. Yes, there's plenty of ammunition in Syria.
Enough to win a war?
Not enough to win a war, enough to keep the Free Syrian Army going, enough to perhaps keep Jabhat al-Nusra fighting in some areas, or Dawlat Iraq al-Sham or someone like that. But at the end of the day, if you're going to swing the war, you need a qualitative improvement. The Free Syrian Army has no air power. It has no counter-battery capabilities for artillery, for example. It just doesn't have the types of things that you need to be able to defeat an army which is quite well equipped still with tanks, APC units. It's got helicopters, aircraft.
And is still getting them?
There are some replacements coming from Russia. The Iranians are helping out as well with some servicing and things like that. I wouldn't say that the supply levels were what they used to be, but the regime seems to be able to consolidate the areas over which it has control. I think it was a good point made by Elias Hanna there that they don't want to overstretch themselves. They cannot afford to do that, because the moment they do that, they don't have enough force capability to be able to hold one area and then defend another from an attack coming from the south, for example.
General Hanna, who has made the difference here? Would it be those Shia fighters coming from Iran and Iraq and the Hezbollah fighters coming in from Lebanon? Has that been the game changer?
At the beginning, I think that Hezbollah and al-Qusayr was a major turning point tactically. Why? Because they have invested very little forces, very little effort, but you know, the output, the strategic output, the consequences were very huge. But imagine that the Lebanese borders are open for everybody who wants to come to Lebanon and go and fight for jihadist approach, you know. I mean, I think that all of the regime's center of gravity, political as well as demographic, as well as, you know, the Alawi, would be hit, and the regime wouldn't go and, you know, last for that, you know, two years and a half. I think that what we are seeing now in Kalamoun Mountains is the continuation, the consolidation of gains that were made in al-Qusayr. I think al-Qusayr was the major issue. Now, here comes the role of Hezbollah. And I don't think that what is coming from Iraq, like, you know, the Shia militia are doing major shift and major things, because Hezbollah has the experience, has the structure, has the discipline and the motivation, ideologically speaking, and the control and the unity of command. This is the major issue, I think, the Lebanese issue.
Yeah, so Khaled Saleh, one of the problems is that originally you knew who your enemy was. Now it has multiplied. It's not only the Assad regime, it's not only the army, it's also elements of Hezbollah, it's Shia fighters perhaps from Iran and Iraq, and then it is the myriad of jihadist groups, mostly in the north of the country, who seem to be controlling territory and getting massive amounts of weaponry. You don't know who to fight now.
No, we've been very clear, but let me make a very quick comment. Just if you look at what happened since last Sunday until today, and just look at what happened on the ground, we had 11 airplanes. Between 7 MiG airplanes were shot down, military airplanes, and 4 helicopters were shot down. This tells you about the kind of firepower that the FSA brigades are starting to gain on the ground. This, you know, did not happen in the past, but now things are changing.
But the fact is, even if you shoot down
the ground.
10 or 20 of these things, they still have, even if they're only left with one, they've got one more than you.
Oh, definitely, definitely. But hey, we could not shoot a single one about a year ago. We've managed. We're trimming his Air Force power. Step by step. Unfortunately, it's a very painful process and very painful price. But this is the reality of it when you're facing the 13th largest army in the world.
And it is a massive army. Michael Stevens wanted to come in at that point. Trimming the Air Force is the way that Khaled Saleh puts it. But is it more like a sort of a flea biting an elephant?
That's an interesting way of putting it. Ultimately, I think that the Free Syrian Army is not going to be able, using its current capacity, to end Bashar's air dominance in the country. Not that it's spread
and wars
over...
are won in the air.
Well, the vast majority of them can be, although I would say that Bashar's air force is variable in terms of its ability to perform in the north versus in the south. And it certainly has no capability whatsoever in the east. So ultimately these are different conflicts and they take different shapes depending on what city you're fighting in. For example, if you're a Free Syrian Army in Homs, the biggest problem you have is artillery. They're getting absolutely pounded by artillery. It's not so much the aircraft question. In Aleppo and in the north, one of the biggest things that the Free Syrian Army was trying to do was to shoot down aircraft as they were taking off from the runways, because they knew that air power there was a particularly difficult part to stop, and by that point, when Aleppo was taken, Bashar's forces were sort of kept in barracks, and they didn't have supply lines. So it was an important point.
I want to ask Elias Hanna. You've overseen many campaigns as a serving soldier and also as a commentator. How has this war changed since it began to today? What is the nature of the conflict now compared to at the beginning?
I think the nature of the war, the kind of war has one nature for political goals. But, the kind of war that the urban warfare, highly urbanized, Syria is not really equipped for such kind of things, the urban warfare, because this is the first time that we see in Syria this kind of war. Syria is destroyed, all of Syria, half of Syria is destroyed and divided. We are not going to see Syria as it used to be. Moreover, between this momentum that was gained by rebels and the Free Syrian Army and this push by the United States of America and the regional powers that going to dethrone Bashar al-Assad, now everything have changed. Everything from the tactical level to the operational, to the strategic, as well as to the management of the international community and the regional community vis-à-vis this particular issue in Syria.
So what do you make
of what's happened?
What do you make of the fact that 24 hours ago or thereabouts, this group of 7 rebel factions said that we're going to form together, we're going to create an Islamic State in the north? What did that say to you?
I think it's too much, but too late. You know what I mean? If you've shown the video. Everybody hates such kind of things and saying, like Islamic State and so on and so on and so on.
But will it make any difference to the conflict?
Regime, I don't think so.
Okay, so Khaled Saleh, let me ask you, it would make it more difficult perhaps to negotiate some kind of settlement if there were factions that weren't prepared to deal with those people who were at Geneva too?
No, let's be very clear. Those guys who made the announcement yesterday represent 50 to 60% of the fighting force on the ground. Now, some of them had political representation. Some of them actually are represented within the Syrian coalition. It is very important for us, if we are going to go through a political process, a meaningful political process, a meaningful and a successful Geneva, that those who are controlling the ground, those who are actually sacrificing their lives must be represented. They must have a say in whatever peace deal that we have at the end. And I think just as much some people have the right to say, we have a secular dream for Syria, those guys have an Islamic dream. As long as we go through the ballot box, they are very welcomed, and that's exactly what they intend on doing. They are going to present their case, and they're going to try and sell to the Syrian streets, and ultimately the Syrian citizen is going to cast a vote and is going to make a decision on the final shape of Syria.
So let me just ask you this. I may be slightly confused by you as a man wanting to have Syria independent of Bashar al-Assad's rule, would be quite happy to live in an Islamic State of Syria.
What I would be happy for is whatever regime Syrian people choose, whatever system Syrian people choose, as long as we go through the ballot box, as long as there's a social contract that guarantees the right of every Syrian citizen, regardless of their ethnic or religious background, I'd welcome that. And I think whether it's a secular or democratic or Islamic, secular or Islamic, at the end, as long as we have the same social contract that guarantees the rights of everybody, I welcome that. And you know, if they have a project, if they have a vision, present it to the Syrian street and try and sell it to the Syrian people.
Elias Hanna, you were shaking your head at that point.
No, I mean, Syria will never come as used to be, you know. We're talking about Shia, Sunni, Alawi, you know, and Druze and maybe Christians, because they are irrelevant in this fight. We'll never see. I think in Syria, the political solution will be determined by the tactical level, who controls the ground. And maybe the 2014, it's gonna go like this one, and we will have in Syria al-Lebanese, you know, the Taif agreements, based on sectarian division of political power and economic power.
Michael Stevens, if that is the case, who wants to control which areas and which ones are the most important?
Well, first of all, I want to respond to Khaled's point, which is that this new front which has been created, we don't know how unified it's going to be, but it represents something between 45 and 50,000 fighters. Now, they're going to have a serious impact. And if we take Elias's line that the people controlling events on the ground are going to have the biggest political say, which is what I think we all feel now, is that this disconnect between the politics, the SMC and Salam Idris trying then to get the changes on the ground. We've got to look at the people who are controlling the forces. And I'm not so sure that I have faith that this new Islamic coalition is going to stick with the traditional political blocs that exist. I mean, we may see it right now, but in the future they may find their own vehicle for change and their own sort of, they've got the force.
But going back to the point, the original point, my original point, I beg your pardon, is if it comes down to territorial gains and who does what on the ground, who will want to have which particular areas, or sorry, which areas is it most likely to be able to control?
Well, at the end of the day, the strongest parts of sort of opposition strongholds are around Idlib, Aleppo. If you go a little bit further south, they've got the countryside, particularly around Idlib. I don't see the regime ever getting that back, for example. Homs and Hama are still contested, so we're not really sure who's going to hold those out, but the regime is keeping these bombardments up, particularly around Homs at the moment. So at some point, if the regime keeps up this pressure, I don't know if the Free Syrian Army would hold out. But it's clear the regime wants Damascus. The Free Syrian Army can only get sort of eastern parts of Damascus and some suburbs. Deraa is also, we haven't talked about Deraa at all, and there is a huge conflict going on there right now with the Saudis involved, the Americans are involved, Free Syrian Army, Jabhat al-Nusra, the regime. It's all a bit of a sort of winner-takes-all cluster sort of battle. So at the moment, you know, you've got to have the major cities if you want to control Syria.
But Assad is more powerful. If there is a Geneva II before the end of this year, he's in a more powerful negotiating position than he was, let's say, 6 months ago.
He was,
briefly.
but I doubt that there'll be a Geneva II, frankly.
I think you're not the only person who believes that. Let's come to you two, Elias Hanna and Khaled Saleh, just for a final word on this. Would you have been surprised 12 months ago, Elias Hanna, to see Bashar al-Assad's forces in this position, or was it always inevitable?
Within the next 12 months, you're saying?
No, I wondered if 12 months ago you would have foreseen where we are now.
Yes, because when I was asked after 2 months of this, beginning of the civil war, or beginning what's happening in Syria today, I said it's long journey, and it's gonna be bloody journey.
Khaled Saleh, you never thought it was going to be easy to be able to do this, but did you ever foresee a commentary coming around where people are suggesting that Bashar al-Assad may well be in the ascendancy?
I don't think things are how you imagine them. I still travel in and out of the country. I'm actually heading back there in the next 3-4 days. What's important to me is, let's just kind of take this, and this is going to be released next week. We just conducted a poll all across Syria, and we track very carefully how Bashar al-Assad is doing. He is now enjoying the least support. Less than 8% of Syrians, liberated, non-liberated areas, support him. That includes even minorities, which is really the lowest. The Syrian coalition numbers are also on the decline, but they're doing much better than the Assad. We're at 45%. So I think things are better, and they are where they should be at.
Indeed, a sincere thanks to all of my guests out of Istanbul. We had Khaled Saleh talking on behalf of the Syrian National Coalition. In Beirut, Elias Hanna, retired Lebanese Army General, and here in Doha, Michael Stevens. That is just about it for today. We have been talking about the military situation on the ground in Syria. And as one commentator recently returned from Aleppo said, through the battle for Aleppo, you can see the future of the Syrian revolution. And as we've discovered in the last 30 or so minutes, at the moment it is still not possible to see what that vision is. Thank you for joining us here on Al Jazeera. We have continuing and extensive coverage of what's happening in Syria, not just on this programme, but with our hourly updates on our news programmes and, of course, online at aljazeera.com. From me, David Foster, and the Inside Syria team, thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.